Hey, we're going to start section 7.2. Excuse me. This is the quadratic formula. I think probably a lot of you are familiar with it. I used to give this problem on this page as an extra credit on my Algebra 2 tests in high school, and I was always surprised how many people actually got it right. This is how you derive the quadratic formula. Some brainiac didn't just like invent it and, couldn't explain where it came from. It actually comes from completing the square on our quadratic equation. So I'm not going to hold any of you to this, but I am just going to explain it just a little bit so you kind of have an idea of where it comes from. So this is the quadratic equation that we've known since the beginning of quadratics, I guess you should say. And we're going to complete the square on it and then do the square root property just like we did in the last section. And that will give us the quadratic formula. So first off, remember how we have to divide everything by the leading coefficient. So divide everything by a, and you end up with this: 1x squared plus b over ax plus c over a equals 0 divided by anything is 0. So same exact step. We're just doing it with letters now instead of numbers. And we just did, 3 in a row like this on our last notes? Okay, so here's our new problem. Step 2, if you remember from the last section, was keep the x's on the left, move everything without an x to the right. So we would subtract c over a, subtract c over a, and that left us with x squared plus b over ax plus blank equals negative c over a plus blank. So same thing we did with numbers. Again, we're just doing it with letters. Now we're going to do half of b squared because we want to decide what goes in those blanks. So look at your term in front of x. It's b over a. So this would be 1/2 times b over a squared. So that's b over 2a squared. So b over 2a squared. Does everybody see where that came from? 1 times b is b, 2 times a is 2a squared. So I put it in the blanks. Both the blanks got filled in with b over 2a squared. Then we have our little cutesy shortcut for factoring. Take the square root of the first term, use this sign, take the square root of the last term and put it in parentheses. So the square root of x squared is x. Bring down the plus sign, square root of b over 2a squared. The 2's cross out and we just get b over 2a. And remember that quantity squared because it's really x plus b over 2a plus x plus b over 2a, but we just skip that step and go right there. And this side just comes down for now. So now we need to find a common denominator. So this is negative c over a. And this is b squared over 4a squared. Because doesn't that squared mean square the b and square the 2a? So b times b squared, 2a times 2a, 4a squared. And then we need to find a common denominator because in order to add these two fractions, they need a common denominator. So it looks like it's going to be 4a squared. Remember how you have to take the highest exponent, right? Everything you see with the highest exponent. Back to chapter 6 again. Never knew that was so important, huh? Or chapter 5, that is. So times 4a to make a common denominator. And it turns into negative 4ac over 4a squared plus b squared over 4a squared. And then I just switch the order, b squared minus 4ac, and I put them over a single fraction because now they have a common denominator. So I took this and put it right here. But since we have a squared quantity equals some number, that means I have to solve it using square roots just like we did in the last 3 problems on the last section. So 2 of something comes out as a single. Because we square rooted both sides, we need the plus or minus. And this would be square root b squared minus 4ac. And then the square root of 4a squared is 2a. So it's out of the radical. This has to stay under. And then just one more step. Subtract b over 2a, because remember we're solving for x. So this was the last step on all of our problems earlier. And so this is what the new problem is. X is alone. We have plus or minus, and we have the minus b over 2a. Now, because they have a common denominator, we can write them as one fraction. I just switched the order. Remember how I said we want the radical second? So it'd be negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Be nice if I was showing that as I talked about it, right? So these have a common denominator. So you do negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And that, my friends, is called the quadratic formula. And that is one of the formulas you do have to have memorized for the test. There's a couple of them. There's determinants. There's quadratic formula. There's the b over 2a. And then there's a vertex formula. So I think there's about 4 formulas you have to memorize for this next test. This is a chapter, by the way, in Math 150 too. And this is usually where students say, oh my gosh, I'm glad you did a really good job with chapter 7, because this was my best grade in Math 150 was when we did quadratics again, because they remembered a lot of it since it's at the kind of towards the end of our course. Well, it is now for us because we got some weeks took away. But anyway, so you'll see almost this entire chapter in its entirety. And this, like I said, is usually where students make up points because they start out really struggling in 150, and then this kind of gives them a boost up. I think it's the 3rd chapter they do. So it's usually a time when I see them smiling, they're happy. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to page 2. So here is it defined, the quadratic formula. My paper clip on so my pages stay together. So I would definitely highlight this because, like I said, this is one of the formulas that you do have to remember for the test. So how we read it, and I would say, especially since a lot of you are probably working at home by yourself, say it out loud every time. It's so much easier to remember if you say it out loud. I was in a class once watching a teacher when I just started teaching at the community college, which was, 20 years ago. And a teacher actually sang it with her students every day, like a Pop Goes the Weasel song. Opposite of B, plus or minus. I'm a terrible singer, so I'm not going to do it. But every day, that's how they started out class in this chapter, was singing the quadratic formula. But just saying it out loud works really well too. So you do have to know that A is a coefficient in front of x squared, B is a coefficient of x, C is a constant, and the formula is x equals opposite of B. Do not say negative B. It's the opposite of B. So if B is a negative, that number will be positive. If B is a positive, that number will be negative. So it is not read negative B. It's the opposite of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. And we always say all over because a lot of students want to put it just right there. So opposite of B plus or minus square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. And like I said, every time you write it, say it out loud and you'll have it memorized in no time. Okay, so let's go ahead and do some of these. These are pretty fun. We'll do one together and then maybe you guys can do 2 of them and practice. Something you're going to be doing for the rest of your math life, quadratic formula. I always have students say, well, why do we need to know quadratic formula? I know how to factor. Well, not everything factors. When you bring the 2 over here, we're looking for factors of 14 that add to 8, and there aren't any. So we need a plan B when something doesn't factor. So step 1 of quadratic formula, let's go up here and write it, is set equal to 0, just like when you're factoring. So you don't move the constants over to the right like we did with completing the square. We do it like we did with factoring. Always set it equal to 0. So you cannot know, you don't know what A, B, and C are. If you leave it like this, you'll think A is 7, B is 8, and C is -2, when it's really +2. So it would mess up your whole formula. So that is very, very, very important, is set equal to 0 at the very beginning. Otherwise, your A, B, and C will not be correct. So following that, to set this equal to 0, we have to add 2 to both sides. So 7x squared plus 8x plus 2 equals 0. And then after that, we just name our A, B, and C. And I like to say we plug and chug. We go right into a calculator. And make sure you don't do these on your graphing calculator. Make sure you do them on your scientific, because we are going to have a lockdown browser with video for your tests. So nobody can use a graphing calculator on these. They have to be done by hand. So sorry, I just tipped that. A is 7, B is 8, and C is the constant 2. So now we're ready to plug it into the formula. So remember how I told you if you write something 7 times, you'll have it memorized? Well, we get to practice 3 here, so do 4 homework problems and you'll have it memorized. So x equals opposite of b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So let's plug and chug. So x equals opposite of b. Well, b is 8, so the opposite of b is -8. B squared, 8 times 8 is 64, minus 4 times a, which is 7, times c, which is 2, all over 2a, 2 times 7. And I've been teaching a long time, and I will tell you 99.99999% of the mistakes on quadratic formula right here. Don't do it in pieces. Don't do it in your head. Just pick up your calculator and type everything that's underneath. Don't type the radical, just everything that's underneath. So this is how I get ready for it. -8 plus or minus empty radical over 14. So that way all I have to do is type it into the calculator. And like I said, don't hit enter and do it in pieces. Just type the whole thing in, hit enter at the end, but don't type the radical because the radical has to be simplified. So we have 64 minus 4 times 7 times 2, and that is 8. Ooh, gotta like that for easy, huh? So now this is where the last chapter comes into play. We have to know how to simplify a radical. So if you remember, 8 is 3 2s. I'm just going to put it up here so we don't take up any more room. So 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8. So 2 times 2 times 2, which means it's going to come out as 2 rad 2. So we're going to run out of time, but let's get this next step written down. So -8 plus or minus 2 rad 2 over 14. and we'll simplify it on the next video.